The evening rain tapped against the restaurant windows like impatient fingers as Margaret wiped down the last table. Her feet ached in a way that only comes after 30 years of standing, and the arthritis in her hands made each twist of the rag a small victory. She was 68 years old and had been counting the minutes until closing when the door swung open. A man in an expensive suit walked in, his phone pressed to his ear, waving dismissively at the closed sign. She recognized him immediately, Richard Hendricks, the real estate developer whose face smiled from billboards across town. He didn't look at her, not really, just gestured toward a corner booth, as if her time belonged to him. Margaret's grip tightened on the rag. There were things this man couldn't buy, couldn't demand, couldn't understand. But in a few moments, she would teach him something money never could. "Where are you watching from tonight?" Margaret had worked at the Silver Spoon Diner for 43 years. She'd started as a young woman of 25, newlywed and hopeful, saving tips to help her husband Tom build their dream life together. The years had carved themselves into the worn vinyl of the booths, the faded checkerboard floor, the menu that hadn't changed since 1987. She knew every regular customer by name, remembered their usual orders, asked about their grandchildren. The diner wasn't fancy, but it was hers in all the ways that mattered. Tom had passed away 6 years ago. Heart attack, sudden and cruel, the kind that steals your future in an afternoon. They'd been married for 37 years. No children, they'd tried for a decade before accepting it wasn't meant to be, but they'd had each other, and that had been enough. After Tom died, Margaret kept working. The house was too quiet, too full of memories that hurt as much as they comforted. The diner gave her purpose, gave her the connection to people she desperately needed. Richard Hendricks settled into the booth without removing his coat, phone still glued to his ear. Margaret approached slowly, her order pad ready. She'd served men like him before, men who looked through service workers as if they were furniture. But she'd also learned that everyone, even the coldest heart, was fighting battles others couldn't see. "I'll need coffee. Black. And whatever your steak special is." "Well done," he said, not bothering to pause his phone conversation. "No, not you, Jerry. I'm at some diner." "Yes, I know it's late. Just close the Riverside deal. I don't care if you have to stay up all night." Margaret jotted down his order. "Sir, I should mention we close in 15 minutes. He glanced up, annoyed by the interruption. "So, I'm a customer. You'll stay open." He returned to his call, dismissing her with a wave. She stood there for a moment, the weight of the day pressing down on her shoulders. Her daughter-in-law, Tom's nephew's wife, was in the hospital. Stage 4 cancer. Margaret had promised to visit tomorrow before her shift, had saved up to buy flowers. She thought of her own empty house waiting, the pills she needed to take for her blood pressure, the heating pad for her back. "Sir," she tried again, softer this time. "We're short-staffed tonight, and I've been here since 6 this morning." Richard finally looked at her, really looked, but his eyes held no warmth. "Listen, I don't know your name and I don't need to. I work 14-hour days building this city. I create jobs. I sign your paycheck in a way, so you can stay an extra hour. It won't kill you." The words landed like slaps. Margaret felt her face flush, not with anger, but with something deeper, a sadness for this man who measured human worth in hours and dollars. She thought of Tom, who'd worked construction his whole life, who'd come home with dirt under his nails and love in his eyes, who'd never made much money but had been richer than any man she'd ever known. "I'll put your order in," she said quietly. Turning toward the kitchen, the cook, Jimmy, was already cleaning the grill. He'd worked there almost as long as Margaret, was ready to get home to his wife and the Tuesday night poker game with his buddies. He looked at the order slip and sighed. "One more?" he asked. "One more," Margaret confirmed. "The entitled kind." Jimmy fired up the grill again without complaint. That was the thing about people who truly worked for a living. They understood. They didn't need to be told that dignity wasn't found in a title or a bank account. It was found in showing up, in doing right by others, in small acts of grace. Margaret brought the coffee. Richard was still on his phone, negotiating, demanding, commanding. She set the cup down gently and noticed something, a photograph tucked into his wallet as he pulled out a credit card. A young woman, maybe his daughter, smiling brightly. The photo was creased and worn, as if he looked at it often. Something shifted in Margaret's chest. She returned to the counter and waited for Jimmy to finish the steak. The diner was silent except for Richard's voice echoing off the empty walls. She thought about Tom's funeral, how the church had been packed with people whose lives he'd touched. Construction workers and neighbors, the mailman and the lady from the grocery store. What would Richard's funeral look like? Would it be full of business associates checking their watches, or would there be anyone who truly mourned the man beneath the suit? The steak was ready. Margaret carried it to his table, set it down with silverware rolled in a napkin. Richard ended his call and picked up his knife and fork, ready to eat without acknowledgement, without gratitude, without seeing her at all. That's when Margaret made her decision. She had something to tell this man, something he needed to hear. Richard cut into his steak, the knife scraping against the plate. Margaret stood there, just a moment longer than necessary. He looked up, irritated. Was there something else? Actually, yes, Margaret said, surprising herself with the steadiness in her voice. I'll stay and let you finish your meal. But I wanted to tell you something. He set down his fork, clearly annoyed, but perhaps sensing something different in her tone. Make it quick. Margaret pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. His eyebrows shot up. No waitress had ever presumed to sit at his table, but she met his gaze with calm dignity. My husband used to say that the measure of a person isn't what they demand from the world, but what they give to it, she began. He worked construction for 40 years. Never made more than $40,000 a year. But when he died, over 300 people came to his funeral. Men he'd worked with, neighbors he'd helped fix a fence or repair a roof. People he'd just been kind to over the years. Richard's jaw tightened. Look, I didn't come here for a sermon. I know, Margaret continued, her voice gentle but firm. You came here because it was convenient. Because you could. Because somewhere along the way, you stopped seeing people like me as people at all. She paused, letting the words settle. But I see you, Mr. Hendricks. I saw that photo in your wallet. His hand instinctively moved to his jacket pocket, protective. That's none of your business. You're right, it's not. But I'm a mother too. Well, I was going to be. Margaret's voice caught slightly. My husband and I, we tried for years. Never happened. But I know that look in a parent's eyes when they carry a picture worn from being held. That's love. Real love! Something cracked in Richard's expression. For just a moment, the armor slipped. My daughter, Sarah, she's 26. She's beautiful, Margaret said softly. Does she know you're working this late? The question landed with unexpected weight. Richard looked down at his plate, the steak growing cold. She doesn't call much anymore. We had a falling out 3 years ago. She said I chose work over family, that I missed too many birthdays, too many moments. She was right, but I didn't know how to tell her that. So I just kept working, kept building, kept telling myself I was providing for her, even though she didn't want my money. She wanted her father. Margaret felt her heart squeeze. This was it, the wound beneath the armor, the pain that made people cruel. Have you tried reaching out to her? Hundreds of times. She doesn't answer. I don't blame her. Richard's voice was barely above a whisper. My wife left me 2 years after Sarah stopped talking to me. Said I was more married to my business than to her. She was right, too. Now I have a penthouse full of expensive furniture and no one to share it with. I eat alone. I work alone. I'm alone. The diner felt smaller, suddenly intimate. Margaret reached across the table and placed her weathered hand on his. He didn't pull away. It's not too late, she said. It's never too late to say you're sorry, to try again. My Tom, he taught me that people need grace, that everyone is carrying burdens we can't see. You demanded I stay late tonight, and I was angry. But now I see a man who's forgotten how to go home because there's no one waiting for him there. Richard's eyes were red-rimmed. He'd probably never cried in front of anyone in years. But here in this empty diner, with a 68-year-old waitress who'd seen too much of life to judge, something broke open. I don't know how to fix it, he admitted. I don't know how to be anything other than what I am. You start small, Margaret said. You start by seeing people. Really seeing them. You practice kindness like it's a muscle you've forgotten how to use. You call your daughter, and even if she doesn't answer, you leave a message telling her you love her and you're sorry. You do it again tomorrow, and the next day, Until maybe, one day, she believes you've changed. Margaret stood slowly, her knees protesting. Your meal is on the house tonight, Mr. Hendricks. Not because you demanded to be served, but because I think you needed to talk to someone more than you needed to eat. If this moment touched your heart, please give this story a thumbs up. Your support means the world. Richard looked up at her, and for the first time that evening, he really saw her. The lines around her eyes from years of smiling at customers. The tiredness in her posture, the grace in her worn hands. What's your name? He asked. Margaret. Margaret Foster. Margaret, he repeated, as if memorizing it. Thank you. I'm sorry for how I spoke to you. She nodded, accepting the apology. We all have hard days, Mr. Hendricks. The key is not letting them turn us into hard people. As Margaret walked back to the counter, Richard pulled out his phone. His hand hovered over his daughter's contact information, that familiar fear rising in his chest. But something had shifted. Something about this grandmother of a waitress, this woman who had every reason to be bitter but chose grace instead, made him brave. He pressed call. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Then a voice he hadn't heard in 3 years answered. Dad? Richard's hand trembled as he held the phone. Sarah's voice, cautious and questioning, hung in the air between them like something fragile that could shatter with one wrong word. Sarah, he breathed, barely able to form her name. There was a long pause. Margaret, wiping down the counter, watched him from the corner of her eye. She saw the way his shoulders hunched forward, how years of practiced business confidence dissolved into the vulnerable posture of a father who'd lost his way. Why are you calling? Sarah's voice was guarded, years of disappointment built into those 4 words. Richard closed his eyes. Every instinct screamed at him to explain, to justify, to list all the reasons he'd worked so hard. But Margaret's words echoed in his mind. People need grace. They need to be seen. I'm calling to say I'm sorry, he said simply. I'm sorry for missing your graduations, your birthdays, your life. I'm sorry for choosing spreadsheets over dinner conversations, for answering emails when you needed me to just listen. I'm sorry for not being the father you deserved. The silence stretched so long Richard thought she'd hung up. Then he heard it, a small, choked sound that might have been a sob. I waited so long to hear you say that, Sarah whispered. Do you know how many times I called you Dad? How many times I needed you and got your voicemail? The words cut deeper than any business failure ever could. Richard felt tears spill down his cheeks, no longer caring about dignity or image. I know, and I can't take those years back. But I'm here now. I'm finally here. Are you, though? Sarah's voice carried equal parts hope and skepticism. Or will you disappear again the next time a deal needs closing, the next time work calls? It was the question that mattered most, and Richard knew his answer would determine everything. He looked around the modest diner, at Margaret, who'd shown him more wisdom in 30 minutes than he'd found in years of success. He thought about his empty penthouse, his silent phone, the way he'd measured his worth in zeros on a bank statement while losing track of what actually counted. I can't promise I'll be perfect, Richard said slowly, each word deliberate. But I promise I'll try. I promise I'll show up, and if I start to slip back into old patterns, I give you permission to call me out, to walk away if you need to. But Sarah, please, give me a chance to know my daughter again. Let me learn who you've become. Margaret approached with a box of tissues, setting them quietly on the table. Richard nodded his thanks, wiping his face. I'm engaged, Dad, Sarah said suddenly, to a man named Daniel. He's a teacher. We're getting married in 5 months, and I didn't invite you because I didn't think you'd care enough to come. The words landed like a physical blow. His little girl, getting married, and he wasn't even going to be there. Richard felt the full weight of his choices, the cost of his ambition, measured in moments he could never reclaim. I'll be there, he said, his voice thick with emotion. If you'll have me, I'll be there. And I won't check my phone. I won't schedule meetings. I'll be present, Sarah, I swear to you. Another long pause. Why now, Dad? What changed? Richard looked at Margaret, who'd returned to the counter but was listening, her eyes kind and knowing. I met someone tonight who reminded me that people matter more than profits. That kindness is a choice we make every single day. that it's never too late to become the person we should have been all along. Have you ever faced something like this, realizing you've lost sight of what matters most? Let us know in the comments. Your stories help us all feel less alone. I'd like to meet her, Sarah said, and Richard heard something new in her voice. Not forgiveness yet, but maybe the beginning of it. The woman who got through to you when no one else could. Her name is Margaret. She's a waitress who should have gone home an hour ago, but she stayed to teach a foolish man about grace. I'm scared to hope. Dad, Sarah admitted, and the vulnerability in her voice broke something in Richard's chest. I've been disappointed so many times. I know. I'll earn your trust back, one day at a time, one conversation at a time. I love you, Sarah. I've loved you every single day, even when I was too blind to show it. I love you too, Dad, she whispered. Call me tomorrow. I'll call you tomorrow, Richard promised. And the day after that, for as many days as it takes. When the call ended, Richard sat in the booth, spent and transformed. Margaret approached with the check, marked $0, and a gentle smile. She answered, Richard said, awe in his voice. The people who love us are usually waiting for us to come home, Margaret replied. We just have to be brave enough to walk through the door. Richard stayed in the booth for another 20 minutes. Not eating, just sitting with the weight of the conversation, letting it reshape him from the inside out. Margaret cleaned around him quietly, giving him space to process, to feel, to begin the work of becoming someone new. Finally, he stood, reaching for his wallet. Margaret, I can't let you count my meal. Please. She shook her head firmly. Some things aren't about money, Mr. Hendricks. Tonight was about something bigger. Richard, he corrected gently. Call me Richard. Mr. Hendricks is the man who walked through that door demanding service. Richard is the man I'm trying to become. Margaret smiled, the kind of smile that had comforted thousands of customers over 4 decades, warm and genuine. Richard, then. He pulled out his business card, then hesitated. This was the old way, throwing money at problems, offering business solutions to human connections. Instead, he pulled out a piece of paper from his notebook and wrote down his personal cell phone number. I want to invite you to Sarah's wedding, he said. If she'll have me there, I want you there too. You gave me back my daughter tonight. That's worth more than anything I could ever pay you. Margaret's eyes glistened. I'd be honored, Richard. Truly honored. And Margaret, Richard continued, his voice stronger now, purposeful. This diner, does the owner ever consider selling? Her expression grew guarded. Mr. Patterson has owned it for 30 years. He's getting older, talks sometimes about retiring. Why? Because it deserves to stay open, Richard said. Places like this, where people like you work, where kindness still matters, they're what builds real community. Not my high-rise developments, not my shopping centers. Places where a waitress can change a man's life over a cold steak. Margaret studied him carefully. What are you thinking? I'm thinking I've spent my career building things nobody really needs. Maybe it's time to preserve something that matters. Richard looked around the diner with new eyes, the worn booths that held decades of conversations, the counter where people sat alone and found companionship, the photographs on the walls of regulars who'd passed on but weren't forgotten. If Mr. Patterson wants to sell, I'd like to buy it. Keep you on as manager, keep everything exactly as it is. No renovations, no franchise deals. Just a safe future for a place that serves more than food. Tears spilled down Margaret's cheeks. The diner had been her sanctuary after Tom died, her purpose when grief tried to swallow her whole. The thought of losing it to some developer who'd gut it and turn it into expensive condos had haunted her since Mr. Patterson started talking about retirement. You'd really do that? She asked. I would. Not as an investment, but as an apology to every person I've overlooked, every worker I've dismissed, every community I've displaced for profit. Richard's voice was steady, committed. Let me do something right, Margaret. Let me build a legacy that my daughter can be proud of. If you've been enjoying this story and want to see more heartwarming tales like this one, please subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us share more stories that matter. Margaret reached across and squeezed his hand. Tom would have liked you, Richard. The real you, not the man who walked in here tonight. He always said people deserve second chances. I wish I could have met him, Richard said honestly. He sounds like he understood what I'm only beginning to learn. He'd say you're right on time, Margaret replied. That every journey starts with a single step, and you took yours tonight. As Richard finally prepared to leave, putting on his coat and gathering his phone, the diner felt different. Sacred, almost. This unremarkable place with its old vinyl and faded checkerboard floor had become the site of a transformation, a moment when one man's heart cracked open and let the light back in. Margaret, Richard said at the door, turning back one more time. Thank you. For staying. For sitting with me. For seeing me when I'd forgotten how to see myself. We all need someone to remind us who we really are, Margaret said. Go home, Richard. Call your daughter tomorrow like you promised. Start building the life you want, not just the empire you thought you needed. He nodded, stepping out into the rain that had softened to a gentle mist. The city looked different now, not as a collection of properties and opportunities, but as a place where people lived and loved and struggled and hoped. Each lit window held a story. Each person on the street carried dreams and disappointments, just like him. Richard drove home to his penthouse, but instead of heading to his home office, like he would have any other night, he sat on his balcony and looked at the city lights. He thought about Sarah's wedding, about walking his daughter down the aisle if she'd let him. He thought about Margaret and Tom, about 40 years of partnership built on love instead of leverage. He thought about the diner and the legacy he wanted to leave behind, not buildings with his name on them, but spaces where people mattered, where kindness still thrived. For the first time in years, Richard Hendricks felt something he'd forgotten existed. Hope. Not hope for a successful deal or a profitable quarter, but hope for connection, for redemption, for becoming a better man. The journey was just beginning, but he was finally walking in the right direction. 5 months passed like pages turning in a well-loved book, each one bringing Richard closer to the man he'd promised to become. True to his word, he called Sarah every single day. At first, the conversations were brief and cautious, years of hurt carefully guarded between them. But gradually, walls came down. She told him about Daniel, about her job at the children's hospital, about her dreams of adoption someday. He listened, really listened, asking questions and remembering details, showing up in the way he'd failed to before. Richard bought the Silver Spoon Diner from Mr. Patterson in March. The older man wept when he learned it would be preserved exactly as it was, that Margaret would manage it, that the staff would keep their jobs. I thought I'd have to sell to some chain that would tear out my daddy's original counter, Mr. Patterson said, shaking Richard's hand with gratitude. You're a good man, Mr. Hendricks. Richard thought about correcting him, explaining he was just learning to be good, but accepted the words as a direction rather than a description. Margaret thrived as manager. She gave Jimmy a raise and hired 2 more waitresses, easing the workload on everyone. She created a wall of photographs celebrating longtime customers, a visual history of the community that had made the diner their second home. Richard visited once a week, always calling ahead, always asking if it was convenient. He'd sit at the counter with coffee and listen to Margaret's stories about the regulars, learning names and lives, understanding finally what real wealth looked like. The wedding day arrived in May with perfect spring weather, the kind that makes everything feel possible. Richard stood in the church vestibule, his hands trembling as he waited for Sarah. She appeared in her mother's vintage wedding dress, altered to fit perfectly, and when she saw her father standing there in his tuxedo, tears streaming down his face, she started crying too. You came, she whispered. I'll always come, Richard promised. For every moment you'll let me. I've missed too much, Sarah. I won't miss any more. She took his arm, and together they walked down the aisle. Richard had turned off his phone the entire weekend. No business calls, no emails, no distractions. Just his daughter, her happiness, this moment they'd both nearly lost forever. Daniel was a kind-faced man with warm eyes, and when Richard placed Sarah's hand in his, he saw the way Daniel looked at her, the way Tom must have looked at Margaret all those years. That was the real measure of success, Richard realized. Not money or power, but love given freely and received with gratitude. Margaret sat in the 3rd row, wearing a lovely lavender dress, her eyes bright with joy. After the ceremony, Richard introduced her to Sarah. telling the full story of that rainy night at the diner, how a 68-year-old waitress had saved him from a life of hollow achievement. Sarah hugged Margaret tightly. "Thank you for giving me back my father," she said, voice thick with emotion. "Your father gave himself back, dear," Margaret replied. "I just reminded him where to look." The reception was filled with laughter and dancing, with toasts that spoke of love and second chances. Richard danced with his daughter, holding her close, whispering apologies and promises into her hair. He danced with Margaret too, this woman who'd become an unexpected friend, a guide through his transformation. "Tom would be proud of you," Richard told her as they swayed to a slow song. "You carry his wisdom forward. And he'd tell you that it's never too late to start living right," Margaret said with a smile. "You're doing that now, Richard. Keep going." Over the following months and years, Richard restructured his business. He sold off properties that had displaced communities and invested in affordable housing instead. He created a foundation that supported small, family-owned businesses, places like the Silver Spoon that formed the heart of neighborhoods. His bank account shrank, but his life expanded in ways that numbers could never capture. Sarah forgave him fully. And when she and Daniel adopted twin boys 2 years later, Richard was there for every moment. He taught his grandsons to fish, to throw a baseball, to recognize the value of a person by their character rather than their wealth. He became the grandfather he'd failed to be as a father, and in doing so, healed old wounds for both himself and Sarah. Margaret continued managing the diner until her 75th birthday, when she finally retired. Richard threw her a party that filled the entire restaurant, with speeches from customers whose lives she'd touched over nearly 5 decades. She moved into a cozy apartment with a garden, spent her days volunteering at the hospital, and had Sunday dinners with Richard and his family. One evening, sitting on Margaret's porch watching the sunset, Richard turned to her and said, "You saved my life that night." "No," Margaret corrected gently. "You saved your own life. You just needed someone to show you it was worth saving." They sat in comfortable silence, two unlikely friends brought together by grace and honesty. Richard thought about the man he'd been, demanding, blind, empty, and the man he'd become. The journey hadn't been easy. He'd faced consequences from past mistakes, had relationships he couldn't repair, had to accept that some damage was permanent. But he'd also discovered that change, real change, was possible at any age. You just had to be brave enough to see yourself clearly and humble enough to start again. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video, share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe for more heartwarming tales that remind us what truly matters. Thank you for spending this time with us, for believing in second chances, and for understanding that it's never too late to become who you were meant to be. Until next time, may you find grace in unexpected places and the courage to choose love over everything else.